Hey there, everyone. We're going to go live right now. All right. Welcome to another Instagram and Facebook Live. We're going to give folks just a minute to hopefully show up here. Today we are going to do a little bit of talking about risk. And since it is almost May, a lot of skiing is wrapping up, at least around here in the low country. And we know that a lot of people are transitioning into mountain biking and climbing or hiking or anything like that. And we wanted to talk a little bit about the risk equation that we talk a lot about in the world of snow and avalanches, and then potentially how it translates to other activities. So we thought, this is a great tool when we are using it for backcountry travel, but it's also just a really applicable tool for any outdoor activity, as well as analyzing risk in any other environment. So you want to start?
Sure. Well, yeah, so we'll start off with the...
Flip it around. We did some printing.
Oh, there we go.
So for Facebook folks, check this one out.
We've got, we talked about this a week or two ago, but this risk equation is, and in the snow and avalanche world, we first and foremost have it's the danger. It's the avalanche hazard or danger that exists up in the mountains. And that's, what Mother Nature gives us, what the current avalanche problems are, et cetera. And when we think about that, we're thinking about the likelihood of triggering avalanches. And it says consequence down here, but we're really thinking about the size of the avalanches. And the risk equation then also involves our exposure and our vulnerability. And those are things we can change. The exposure is how we travel through the terrain, what terrain we choose to expose ourselves in. And we can completely avoid the avalanche problem by just not going into the terrain. And then we can change our vulnerability a little bit by wearing a transceiver, being prepared for rescue and things like that. But we can't, exposure is a better way to manage the problem by choosing certain terrain.
So again, risk equation, likelihood times the consequence. This exists no matter what. And then when you think about adding a person or adding an element to this exposure, to the hazard, that's when you really start thinking about risk and how vulnerable something is, as well as how exposed they are. And when you think about likelihood of something happening, when you're thinking about engineering terms, like engineers, when they talk about likelihood, they talk about the probability as 0, as it's impossible for something to happen, or as 100%, as it's certain for it to happen. And I don't know about you all, but in the world of backcountry travel, in the world of mountain biking, in the world of gravel biking, in the world of paddling, climbing, anything like that, that absolutely certain and absolutely not going to happen pretty much never exists. And so thinking about the likelihood of something happening, oftentimes we exist in uncertainty. Here's a graph that shows that. So again, we're not in the world of outdoor pursuits. We exist in a realm of uncertainty, in that it's not absolutely certain that something's going to happen, but it's also not impossible for something to happen. So that's one element of where we exist. And then, so we're thinking about the likelihood. Is it highly likely that something is going to happen? Is it highly likely that I'm going to trigger an avalanche? Is it really unlikely that I'm going to trigger an avalanche? Is it highly likely that I'm going to fall off my mountain bike? Is it highly unlikely that I'm going to fall off my mountain bike? And then along with that likelihood is the consequence. And when I think about the consequence, I think about the impact of something happening. What happens if? What happens if I get avalanched here? What happens if I fall off my mountain bike here? It's really evaluating the terrain, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of a combination of things. Is this point in the correct way?
Yeah.
So the consequence would be a combination in this case of potentially the size of avalanches and then where you were in the terrain. And let's say we had small, just shallow wind slabs. If you triggered an avalanche of that nature down in here, maybe less consequential than triggering an avalanche up above these cliff bands. And the exposure of this terrain is going to greatly increase the risk to that same avalanche problem.
And then what are the other two pieces in terms of risk analysis? You want to go there or you want me to?
Go ahead.
So likelihood of something happening, consequences of something happening, and then you've got vulnerability and exposure. And when I think about vulnerability, one example would be if I'm ice climbing, I'm much more vulnerable if a chunk of ice falls off and hits me in the head, if I'm soloing and I have no rope, versus if I have a rope. So I think about that piece of vulnerability. So if I translate it into the world of snow and avalanches, I am, all things equal, I am much more vulnerable if I'm not wearing a transceiver than if I am wearing a transceiver if an avalanche comes and I'm captured and buried. So vulnerability is this piece of, there are things that you might be able to add to reduce your vulnerability. When you're driving a car, you add a seatbelt to reduce your vulnerability. When you're climbing, you add a rope to reduce your vulnerability. In the world of snow and avalanches, you add a transceiver, you add an airbag, things like that to reduce the vulnerability. If something happens, how can you sort of cushion that blow? Would that be how you would talk about vulnerability?
Yeah, the example I often use is, if an avalanche is triggered onto the highway, a person standing in that run out is going to be much more vulnerable than somebody that's in a car driving underneath that same avalanche path.
Yeah, or you're much more vulnerable if you're standing there rather than standing in a building. Or if you're an old growth tree. Yep. Okay, so we've got likelihood of something happening, the consequences of that thing happening, your level of vulnerability to that incident, and then we have exposure. And the way I've heard exposure described is like your gas pedal of risk, right? So talk a little bit about exposure.
Well, again, in the world of snow and avalanches, it would be the majority of exposure is terrain, and that's the thing we have the most control over, and it also has the most influence on the overall risk. I used this example earlier of a relatively small avalanche. We never want to get caught in an avalanche, but if I were to get caught in a small avalanche, I would rather be down here on the lower part of this slope than up above where I'm going to get tumbled over the cliff bands and almost certainly have serious injury. So we can move through terrain, we can avoid certain terrain, we can choose our up and down routes, and that's the biggest controlling factor we have in our risk and exposure.
So if you're going to translate it to different activities, let's say mountain biking, how do you think about exposure with mountain biking?
Exposure? Well, it's going to be the terrain. It's going to be, there are places where I'm thinking that, if something goes wrong, I'm actually going to tumble many feet down this slope, or I'm tumbling into a talus field or something like that. The exposure is much greater, even though, given a similar trail, a steep drop off on the bottom side, much more exposure, much higher consequence overall to me as a mountain biker.
Great. Okay. So our risk equation, when we think about the world of snow and avalanches, it really can overlay with whatever world we're operating in, right? We can think about it with mountain biking, with climbing, with hiking, with boating, whatever we want to think about. We think about the likelihood of something happening, And on some level that has to do with, you know, in the world of snow and avalanches, it has to do with avalanche hazard, but it also has to do with skill set, right? Like depending on how, like for me, mountain biking, I am probably much more likely to fall off my bike than those competitive high level mountain bikers, right? So, so on some level, it's the outside existing conditions, but on some level, it's your skill set too, right?
Yep.
So the likelihood of something happening, the consequences of that something happening, and then how vulnerable you are. So, and that seems like a harder one to change, that vulnerability piece, than exposure, right? Like
I think it's easier to change the exposure.
So vulnerability, I think about wearing a helmet. I think about wearing an airbag, wearing a transceiver. I think about using a rope if I'm climbing.
And it is activity dependent. There's different variables. I think in a climbing, top roping, or even multi-pitching, you can very much decrease the vulnerability by attaching yourself to a good rope and a good belay.
Yeah.
You know, it's harder to do that with, you know, say mountain biking. We can put padding on, but if I go over the handlebars, it's still going to hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. And then exposure is really where you're choosing to travel. So if you're climbing in loose shit, like in looser terrain versus more solid rock, right? You're more exposed versus less exposed. In the world of avalanches, if you're traveling in avalanche terrain, if you're traveling in steep couloirs that end in the bottom of a cliff, you're much more exposed than 32-degree powder skiing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So with the world of avalanches, then we talk a lot about that, right? Likelihood, consequence, likelihood, size of avalanche. What hints or pointers do you have in terms of being able to use this both in the world of snow and avalanches as well as any other, you know, in the world of mountain biking or boating?
Well, I mean, I think it comes in various stages of the game. It can come in, I think you make a lot of decisions in the planning. You know, in the world of snow and avalanches, I've made a lot of choices when I choose to just my objective for the day. Obviously, I may have different options once I get out there, but if I choose to go, you know, up a certain peak, I've made some of those decisions right then and there, just based on my objective. And then once you're in the field, it truly is just a matter of reassessing all these factors at this, you know, at ongoing basis. It's a situational awareness thing, and you know, just having to be aware of all those things that we talked about. What is the likelihood I might trigger an avalanche? How big is it going to be? And what is the exposure of the terrain below me, and how vulnerable am I in this situation? You know, constantly attempting to minimize those things.
And there's this great question. It is, can you address consequences related to the mechanism of injury? For example, being pushed into trees in an avalanche.
Yeah, I mean, all those things are going to be an ultimate part of your exposure and the ultimate consequences. And yeah, so if I'm on a slope and I get avalanched and it has a nice gentle run out, you know, I'm much less exposed than if I get avalanched through a stand of timber, and you know, my body's impacting those trees at high rate of speed. The example is like jumping out of the back of a truck and trying to grab a telephone pole. So you know, there's that potential for large mechanism of injury drastically does increase the potential consequences.
So when you're thinking about exposure, you can be thinking about slope angle. You can be thinking about, do you have an escape route or not? And then also just asking terrain traps, right? And probably those same things could be asked for mountain biking, right?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not the most impressive mountain biker, as I'm guessing. I think people can guess. But I think a lot about the same risk equation in terms of when I'm going to choose to, like where I'm going to choose to ride and what days I might choose to ride on those trails. Yeah. Cool. So like when I think about, you know, we've beat this to death a little bit, but the avalanche forecasters, when they put a forecast out, talk a lot about the avalanche hazard, right? And that, to me, in our courses, we talk a lot about that just being their effort in terms of having a conversation about risk. And we did print out this graphic for everyone to look at. I'm going to show Facebook, and Don's going to show Instagram, because we learned that in Instagram it's reverse. But you can see on the vertical axis, you have the likelihood of triggering an avalanche. And then on the horizontal axis, you have the destructive size, how big the avalanche is going to be. And then throughout this graph, you have the hazard rating: low, moderate, considerable, high, and extreme. And I think this graph is really interesting in that moderate hazard could mean it's really unlikely that you're going to trigger a pretty big avalanche. But it could also mean it's almost certain that you're going to trigger a small avalanche, right? So, so when we use this risk equation, I think just using likelihood and consequence is not quite enough, right? Then I think what we were talking about is overlaying that vulnerability and that exposure is really what's going to determine the overall consequence, the overall risk, right? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the example I came up with was, you know, I just drew in this avalanche problem here that is a high likelihood of happening, but it's going to be a relatively small avalanche. And your overall risk is going to be very different with the same avalanche problem, depending on the terrain you're in. If I get caught in an avalanche, this kind of an avalanche in terrain that has a gentle run out with, you know, no cliffs, no trees, I may very well end up okay. If I get caught in the same size avalanche in a steep couloir with a cliff, you know, it may be fatal. So the overall risk is going to be a combination of all four of those factors.
Great. So just to summarize this, you know, thanks again for joining us on this Instagram and Facebook Live. What we've been talking about is the risk equation, and as our seasons change, being able to use the same conversation in whatever activity. We can talk about it with surfing, right? We're learning how to surf. We're not very good, but we can have the same conversation with surfing, with mountain biking, with climbing. What's the likelihood of something happening? What's the consequence? How vulnerable are we to whatever consequence that is? And can we reduce that vulnerability? And then what's our exposure? And can we shift that exposure, right? And this conversation, if you can introduce this vocabulary throughout your activities, it makes it a really clean way to actually have a conversation of like, hey, is this really scary, or am I just making this up? And is this okay for us in terms of going out today, or should we choose a different objective, right? Anything else to add?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We, if you've been on past Instagram and Facebook Lives, you've had a tour of our little working office. Now you have a tour of our main kitchen area. We will, if folks are interested and have more topics for us, we'd be happy to cover more topics. Send us a direct message via Instagram, via Facebook, send us an email. And we really hope y'all are enjoying these. And again, if you are traveling in the backcountry, we are still here in Idaho, we're under stay-at-home orders. So think as a citizen of your community, think about the impacts in terms of COVID-19, the impacts on healthcare providers, the impacts on your emergency services if you are traveling, and really have this thorough risk conversation before you travel out in the backcountry. So thank you very much. Have a great one.